This is Keeping the Faith on the Mormon Faircast. The Keeping the Faith series explores ways in which our faith can be challenged and ways in which we can overcome those challenges. This episode features Rich Milllar, a man who lost his faith in the church and in God while a student at BYU. Listen to Rich tell his story about what led to his loss of faith, how he came back, and what he has learned through the process of regaining that faith. Rich Milllar, welcome to the Mormon Faircast.
Thanks for having me.
Tell our listeners a little bit about who you are, and as you do that, I think a lot of our listeners come to FairMormon wondering, what do I do about a friend or a family member who's left the church or is experiencing a faith crisis, or what do I do personally if I'm going through my own faith crisis? And your experience came to my attention from reading an article in the Deseret News that talked about how you had been through this process of leaving the church and coming back, and that you'd written up a summary of your history and posted it on Facebook, and the Mormon channel became aware of that, and they've created a short video that kind of summarizes this, and so I've seen those, and we'll put a link up on our website so that people can refer to those. But I thought it was a great story, and wanted to share it with our listeners. So why don't you start by telling us a little bit about who you are?
Okay. So I've lived most of my life in Utah. I grew up in Murray and Orem mostly. I lived in Orem since I was 8, and just here in Happy Valley, USA, right? I graduated from Orem High, went on a mission to Russia, Samara, came back, went to BYU, graduated from BYU in dietetics and a master's in public health, and then moved to Seattle, which I talk about in my experience, and then decided to move back to Utah to start my own company, which is what I'm trying to do right now. I'm on this kick to try to help people overcome obesity and chronic disease through establishing healthy lifestyles. And I'm married, and I've been married about 1.5 years. We've got our first baby due in a week. And that's a quick rundown.
Yeah, that's great.
Is that good?
No, that's awesome. So give us an idea of your experience growing up in the church. Would you say that you had a testimony of the church, that had you read the Book of Mormon? Did you feel like that you had, burning in the bosom? I mean, what kind of experiences did you have growing up in the church?
Yeah, I would say absolutely. I would say I'm a product of the church and the programs within the church, and I owe a lot of who I am to the church. I loved the church growing up. I fully active, went to church every week, loved going to primary and going through young men's and scouts and Boy Scouts, and loved serving and doing service projects and doing all that stuff. I would say I loved seminary. I mentioned this in the video, but I think that when you're younger, you do things a lot of times because it's what your parents have taught you, and you want to please them, which was true of me. But I became converted to the gospel, and it really reached a climax, or started to become personal for me about the age of 14, and I started to really internalize the principles of the gospel. I started to read my scriptures. I started to, I had always read them, but I started to really read them and dive into them. And my pictures on my wall changed from pictures of Michael Jordan and basketball to pictures of Christ. And
why did you do that? I mean, why does a 14-year-old boy suddenly become interested in studying the scriptures?
I really think, in hindsight, that I felt the Spirit. I felt a strong yearning to do what Christ and Heavenly Father wanted me to do.
Are you able to identify what it was that helped you to feel the Spirit? Were there any teachers that you anything your parents did?
I would say it's a number of things stacked on top of each other, right? I had very loving and supportive parents who had taught me the gospel, who raised me in the gospel, who were a great example of righteousness. I had great leaders at church who I looked up to and respected, who were great fathers and mothers, and who I looked up to and wanted to be like, who were selfless and served and did all of that. And then seminary and great seminary teachers. And I would feel the Spirit so strong. In church, in seminary, in going to, some might laugh at this, but going to EFY, I had really strong spiritual experiences going there. Just great role models and really powerful experiences where I really felt the Spirit very strongly in my life. And I had this great desire to be the best servant I could to Christ and to Heavenly Father, and to maximize that and to try to be a good servant for them. And so it came out of all of those things, and reading the scriptures and studying the scriptures. And it's just, light begets light. And as you bring more light into your life, you yearn for it more and you crave it more. And I would say that from 14 to my mission were kind of the peak time before my mission, where I started to feel the Spirit and understand the Spirit and love it, and love the church, love the gospel of Jesus Christ, and everything that it entails.
And so then you went on a mission.
Uh-huh.
And how was that for you?
Mission was great. I mean, it's like everybody else's. It was hard. It was really hard. It was in Russia, and there's lots of challenges that come with serving in a foreign country and learning another language. I don't think I've ever felt so homesick as I did the first 2 months on my mission. This was before email, with your family home, and so I didn't have any letters from my family until I had been in Russia for 2 months. So I hadn't heard from them, or maybe it was a month. I don't think I received my first letter until I had been in Russia for a month, and it was a hard first month. I don't understand anything. I can't speak very well, and we're being chased on the streets, and just craziness that comes with mission life. And so it was hard, but learned to love it, learned to love the people and serve the people, and great experience, surrounded by great members and great missionaries and great leaders and a great mission president. So,
did you experience any challenges to your faith during that time? I mean, obviously, mission can be hard for a variety of reasons, but any kinds of critical information about the church that shook your testimony, or any challenges that you faced?
Yeah, I would say, I was probably on my mission, which is true for a lot of people if you've grown up in Utah. Not as much now as I think when I was younger, but for the first time I was exposed to a lot of things on my mission that I had never been exposed to before. I was having at one point in my mission in one city I'm thinking of, at the same time we were teaching an atheist and a preacher of another church, and all of these different people from different backgrounds, from different faiths, and you're being hit on every side and challenged. And so that was a time when I'm really diving into the scriptures, really trying to understand, trying to help them. And so there was challenges with it, but I would say that it didn't impact me too bad on my mission. I wasn't shaken necessarily by those experiences.
More challenged, I guess, than shaken.
Yeah.
And so then you come back, and what kind of experience did you have after you came back from your mission? Was it? my understanding is that within the first 3 or 4 months or so, a lot of missionaries can start to kind of taper off in their activity and kind of start falling back into old patterns and old habits that maybe they had before. What was your experience?
Yeah, I would say that wasn't me. I came back and I was as gung-ho after my mission as I was on and before. And I was called to be elders quorum president in my quorum. And so serving people, trying to help them. I mean, I was gung-ho. I was as gung-ho as ever. I wanted to serve in the temple as a temple worker, so I volunteered to do that, and I still felt passionately about the church. I still was very involved, and my testimony was great. Yeah, I was very conservative. I was raised to be very conservative, and I continue to be, and I tended to be more conservative than a lot of the girls that I dated, and not that I absolutely own all of my problems and the mistakes that I made, but I was exposed to other ideas and ways through different girls that I dated because they tended to be less conservative than I was, and so that was one component of many. But anyway,
you're going to BYU at the time?
Yeah, I was going to BYU, and but no, I still love the church. I still love serving in the church. I was still very active. I had callings, and yeah, it was good.
So in your, I guess your biography that you wrote up on your Facebook page, you said, and then it happened, I started to slip. And so how long was it after your mission that you say that you started to slip?
Yeah. It was probably 3 or 4 years after. So I was finishing up my undergraduate degree at BYU, and so coupled with new information, new ideas, I'd been exposed to other ideas, and then I had some personal challenges. I was going through a kind of health challenge, and this kind of created this perfect storm for me that kind of led me down this path where I started to slip.
And so when you say, started to slip, what are you referring to? What is it? You said it didn't happen all at once. There wasn't one moment that set it off, but what kinds of things in retrospect were you able to identify that you would say, that's where I started to slip?
Yeah. I would say that the first things I started to do were the small things. I started to leave out. I mentioned this in my story, and I had always been really good at praying morning and night and reading my scriptures and actively participating in church and looking for ways to serve and doing all these things. And I reached a point where I started to kind of doubt the reason behind that and say, I've done this for so long. I've read my scriptures for so long. I've created my own topical guide for the Book of Mormon, and I know the scriptures. Maybe I don't need to read them as much. And it was really kind of this slow, it wasn't like I'm reading, now I've stopped. It just happened slowly. And okay, maybe I'll not read tonight. And then it turned into 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, a week, a month, whatever. And so now I'm not reading my scriptures as much. I'm not praying as much. I'm not serving in church. I'm not actively looking for ways to serve those around me. And so for me, in hindsight, I really think that my spiritual foundation started to erode by my own doing, because I started to move away from those small and seemingly insignificant factors that are so important. And truly, I believe that, we are spiritual beings, and when you fail to just like anything else in life. I mentioned this as well, but it's true. If you fail to take care of your body by doing the simple principles that are needed every day, your body slowly starts to break down. You are more susceptible to disease or sickness or whatever. The same is true spiritually. If you are failing to do these small things that build you up, over time you become more susceptible to the evil and the darkness and Satan who's out there. And I believe that he is, and I know that he's real. And so those things, and the world is filled with filth. And so if you're not actively participating or actively working to keep it at bay, it will start to creep in. And so I think that was the first thing. And then I started to along with my...
Well, you talk in your story about, you call it complacency and pride.
Yeah.
And I can see how the complacency aspect works into this, that you're just, not doing the stuff that you used to be doing. How do you identify pride as being a factor?
So I started to, I think as you get older and you become more educated, you start to think you're smarter, which is true. I mean, you're learning, you're growing, you're becoming smarter. But I started to think that maybe I had figured it out, that I knew better than, say, the church leaders who had advised me to avoid this or do this. I started to question those things. I started to say, maybe I'm the exception. Maybe I don't need to do X, Y, Z all the time, and this and this isn't going to happen to me because I'm strong enough that I can avoid it. And so I started to become more prideful in my own ability, in my own thinking process, and I started to doubt. And this is kind of coupled with I struggled with a health problem, and it got me down, and I felt like Heavenly Father wasn't there the way that I thought that he would be there for me. I think oftentimes in our life when we experience adversity, we look to Heavenly Father and we say, why me? I've done all these things. I've been good for so long, and now I'm being punished. And we expect everything in life to be rosy and nothing bad to happen. And so when something bad does happen, you say, why me? And so I became a little bit hurt, and I started to think, I felt like maybe Heavenly Father isn't there, and so maybe all this stuff that I've been doing isn't what I thought it was, isn't worth it.
It's not working.
It's not. Yeah, totally. Right.
Yeah. If I were praying and reading my scriptures and going to church and I have some kind of major health crisis, that's not fair.
Yeah. Nothing bad should ever happen to me if I'm doing all these things. Right. What kind of process did you go through? I don't know if you're comfortable going into details with this health problem, but how serious was it? Were you receiving priesthood blessings, and was this something that family members were concerned about? It was. I'm kind of a private person when it comes to these issues, so it wasn't something that I shared broadly with a lot of people. I had close family members who knew about it. I did have priesthood blessings for it and sought them out, and I really believed, I had the faith that if I believed strong, if I had enough faith, the Heavenly Father would take this challenge away from me. And in fact, I would pray for that. I would actively pray specifically for that for years. And in hindsight, this is kind of after the fact, but I think it's important to recognize, and I completely understand now that challenge and other challenges have made me stronger, have helped me to become the person that I am, and helped me to become more like Heavenly Father. And as we know, that's part of life. That's why we're here, to go through adversity, to learn from those experiences, and I'm grateful for it. And I recognize now that Heavenly Father is a wise, all-knowing, loving Heavenly Father who says, I know this is hard for you and is hurting you, but I'm not going to take it away because you need it. And but you don't see that in the moment. And so in that moment, I wanted it to go away, and because it wasn't going away, and I thought that it should, I became a little bit bitter, and it wasn't like immediate, but it grew over time. All this stuff started to compound on each other as I'm slowly not doing all of these other things, and as I'm starting to think that I'm smarter than my parents and my church leaders and all those who have given me good advice over the years. This starts to compound. I start to become complacent. I start to become prideful, and it starts to walk me down this path of doubting everything and ultimately coming to the point where I don't think the church is true anymore.
So did you eventually overcome this health problem?
No, no. It's something that I still deal with, and it's fine. It's something I don't enjoy, but it's part of life, and that's okay.
Okay, and so your perspective on that has changed.
Absolutely.
And that's the difference.
Yeah.
Okay, and in retrospect, I guess you can see how it is that it's been good in the sense that it's helped create the character and the strength that you have now.
Yeah. Yeah.
In your story on Facebook, you talk about complacency and pride. You talk about how you started to go through this paradigm shift and started to see things more cynically. You also talk about instant gratification. Can you elaborate on what you mean by that? What role did that play?
Yeah, I as I started to become more prideful, as I started to doubt all the doctrine and the advice that maybe my parents and the church and the brethren give you, which is great. I fell for, in my view, one of the most fundamental lies out there that is perpetuated by the world, that things like money and fame and sex, drugs, whatever it is, that those can bring lasting happiness, that chasing that type of lifestyle will bring you more happiness and joy, and more long-term happiness and joy than the alternative, which is, living these eternal principles and sticking to them, which may in the moment seem restrictive, but in the long run you realize that they're protective and they help establish this foundation. And so I started to do things that were against what the church taught, seeking this happiness and thinking that this lifestyle would bring me more happiness, and ultimately it didn't, right? So.
And so, without going into details about what it is you're, exactly doing, can you give us an idea of how bad it became in terms of, what was it? Did it call into question your temple worthiness, for example?
Yeah, It did. Again, it was slow. It didn't happen overnight, but eventually I got to the point where I actually had a friend, a close friend who was getting married in the temple, and I wasn't worthy anymore to go to the temple. And I could have lied because I still had my temple recommend. But at that point, I had come to the conclusion personally that the church wasn't true. And so really it would have been no skin off my back to go and lie. I could still have been there. But I didn't feel like it. I didn't feel comfortable going. And so I didn't. And I made up an excuse. I think I said I had to work, and I didn't go. And that was kind of the first time that that happened, but it continued to happen. And I continued to start to avoid opportunities to go to the temple, or because I wasn't worthy, and I couldn't. I had done things that had made me unworthy to enter the temple, although I had not yet at that point told my my priesthood leaders that. They didn't know that, and I still had a temple recommend. I still could have gone.
So how long did this process take? Starting from the time where you said you started to slip, to the time where you decided this church isn't true. Can you give me kind of an estimate on how long that process took?
From the time I started to slip to the point where I thought that the church wasn't true was likely a year to 2 years. And then I continued to maintain that thought process and believe that for the next 2 to 3 years, if I'm doing my math right. So yeah, it was all told, it was about a 4 to 5 year process.
Okay, so year or two, you decide the church isn't true, and then another couple of years, you work your way back.
Yeah.
So talk to me a little bit about this paradigm shift, and what role did cynicism play in your disaffection from the church?
Yeah. Well, I think that once you allow this doubt to creep in, you start to, you just start to be much more cynical of everything, right? And anytime, as you become cynical, you look for ways to find fault with what the church is doing, or with what the church has done. And so you start to say, aha, right there, they made a mistake, they messed up, they're horrible, they've done a bad thing, or whatever. And I started to, and naturally, as you start to look for people who identify with the way that you are feeling at the time. And so I found a group of friends or people who were having the same feelings, and we would discuss this. And you feed each other's fire. You add to each other's cynicism, maybe.
Were these BYU students?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. And so what kind of discussions were you having? What were the kind of cynical notions that you guys were entertaining?
Oh man, it's been so long, and I don't remember specifics, like specific conversations we would have necessarily about specific topics. We would talk about your pretty common issues, Joseph Smith and polygamy, or the Book of Mormon and the way it was translated, or just the way that the leaders receive revelation, and or the fact that they're fallible, that they sometimes make mistakes. And how could a prophet ever, a prophet, if they say they're a prophet, they should be perfect. They should never make a mistake. And so you start to discuss these things. And so I can't remember specific conversations, but it was about those types of things. And we would just discuss them in general. And then we would also discuss how people around us, people that we knew, and girls that we were dating, were naive to this fact, we had come to a greater understanding, and they just didn't know yet. And so,
and if they did know, then they'd be as cynical as you.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
And did you ever keep up with those guys? Do you know what happened with them?
Yeah, I've stayed in contact with some of them. Not all of them. Some of them have had a similar experience to me, and have had a rejuvenation of their testimony, I guess you could say, have come back, and some haven't. Some have stayed away and remained cynical. Not all are cynical, but some have just decided that they want to live another lifestyle. I think some are still trying to figure it out. I think they're still really lost and don't know completely what they're trying to do.
So, I mean, during this time when you're having these discussions with these guys, they're all BYU students.
Yeah.
Were you all open with each other about your beliefs about the church, and were you all kind of at the position where you said the church isn't true, or was it more a matter of you guys all kind of talking about how there are all these problems with the church?
If I'm remembering right, I think it was probably like 50-50. Some had come to the conclusion already that the church wasn't true, and they're just trying to get through BYU and graduate, and then they can go off and do their thing, while others are still trying to figure it out, but they've got serious doubt, and these discussions are feeding that doubt, and so they were still kind of trying to figure that out.
Okay, and you mentioned too in your bio that you had read a lot of negative stuff about the church.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of stuff are you being exposed to? What kinds of things are you reading? How are you being exposed to negative stuff about the church?
I kind of came across it on my own originally. I started to I had read Richard Bushman's Rough Stone Rolling, and from there that led me to which was at that point, I think that now a lot of the things that are, I would say everything that's written in that book is well known to most people within the church, but at the time it wasn't as much, and so some of those things I was exposed to for the first time, and I was exposed to them at the time when I'm already doubting. So I'm already in a position where I'm questioning the leaders, questioning God, if God even exists. And so then I start searching for more answers. So I'm online, I'm just searching for stuff, and I can't recall specific websites or anything that I've gone to, or that I went to, but I was exposed to it through that, and then through these discussions with other friends who were feeling the same way, who then bring in their own, oh, have you heard this, or think about this, or and so I was exposed through those means, and I kind of sought it out. It wasn't necessarily dumped on me, So,
well, and when I asked you what kind of negative information you've been exposed to, you mentioned Rough Stone Rolling.
Yeah.
And from your perspective now, would you characterize that as negative information?
No, and I wouldn't say that Rough Stone Rolling is negative information. But I think that if you've never heard these things, and you're exposed to them, whether it's through Rough Stone Rolling or through some other means, and you're already in a state of doubt, and you're already in a state of wavering and questioning the church and God. Frankly, I didn't even know if God existed anymore. I was trying to figure that out, and so, okay, God doesn't exist, or I don't know if He exists, and now, well, there's all these things that I hadn't heard about, Joseph Smith. And in hindsight, I feel like there are good answers for those things, and they make sense to me as much as they can make sense in the context of history, where we don't have all the pieces, we don't have all the information, etc. Right? But in that state of mind, they just they start to, okay, God doesn't exist, and now there's all these things. Well, maybe the church, I don't know, the church just, if God doesn't exist, then this church isn't God's church, obviously. And so and now I'm learning about these things I've never heard of, and so it just piles on, right?
So it sounds like the difference between how you viewed Rough Stone Rolling then versus how you view it now is your state of mind.
Yeah.
The paradigm with which you're viewing the facts.
Yeah, absolutely. And the paradigm, and I think
assumptions that you make, that you bring to your review of these facts.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and it's totally. Yeah.
Okay. And so why did you decide to read Rough Stone Rolling? I mean, you're deciding, I don't know if I want to pray, I don't know if I don't know if the church is, or maybe I don't even believe in God. And so why would you decide to read Rough Stone Rolling? Was this to kind of gather evidence against the church, or what was it?
To be honest, I don't even remember. I don't know where because I rented it from the BYU library as a student, I remember. But I don't remember why I decided to pick it up. I honestly don't remember. I don't know if someone told me or if, I don't know. I'm not even sure.
And do you remember any kinds of specific facts that you were coming across that, would shake you or were really especially disturbing?
Yeah. Well, I mean, so for instance, I had never heard that Joseph Smith, would put his head into a black hat and translate sometimes, and
using a seer stone.
Yeah, with a seer stone, and so it's just, again, I think it's just, wow, like I've never heard that before. That's kind of weird, and you've never heard it, and so it's this odd thing, and I don't know. I mean, I have no problem with it now. I mean, who really cares if he used a hat or if he didn't use a hat? And he was using the hat to block out light, which makes sense, right? And anyway, so that was one thing. I think just I'm trying to think of others. The fact that there were multiple versions of the first vision. I don't think I'd ever heard that before. And I think just the extent of just going into details with polygamy and how polygamy was, I just didn't know much about it, to be honest. And so all of these things in hindsight, I've been able to work through personally. And but at the time, if you're hearing them for the first time on your own, in this state of mind, in this paradigm, it was, it just added it. And I wouldn't say that was the reason that caused me to leave the church. I was doubting God, and if God doesn't exist, no religion
How do you think you would have received Rough Stone Rolling a couple of years earlier? When you were in this, kind of mode where you're reading your scriptures and you're saying your prayers and you're, engaged in the church and the gospel, and then you find out Joseph Smith used a seer stone. Joseph Smith was a polygamist. You start finding out these facts you weren't aware of before. Do you think that you would have received them differently?
Yeah, absolutely. It's hard to say exactly how. But I think absolutely I would have received them differently. Yeah. No
okay.
question.
So we talked about your complacency. We talked about pride, instant gratification, a paradigm shift, cynicism, and criticism, doubt, and then what happened?
Well, that continued for a while. I decided to take a job opportunity in Seattle, and it was a great opportunity, and I was excited. Honestly, I was excited to leave Utah and being surrounded by Mormons and go somewhere else. And kind of
did your family know at this point that you didn't believe in God and you didn't believe in the church?
No.
Did close friends know?
Yeah, there were close friends.
I guess the friends that you're griping about the church
right?
with, right?
Yeah.
But
they knew there was some.
It wasn't generally known then.
No. So I would say that I don't know. I never felt I was cynical for a time, and very cynical. But at some point, I can't remember exactly when it was, I started to still not believe. I still believed the church was not true. I still felt that, people within the church and people that I knew and people that I loved, family members and friends who were members of the church, that they were maybe misguided, that they just didn't know, that they would find out eventually. But I went from being very cynical and negative towards the church to being able to recognize the good that was still in the church. So I could recognize that there were good people in the church. They were trying to do what's best. And even though maybe the church wasn't true, they believed that it was, and they were doing what they thought was best in their heart. And that includes the brethren. I've through my experience growing up, I had interacted with, apostles on some level. And I went to BYU, Idaho when Elder Bednar was president there, and I interacted with him from time to time. And I knew from personal experience that these were good men who I felt truly cared about the people they were serving and truly believed what they said they believed, even though I didn't think it was true. And so I shifted from being completely cynical and negative and not being able to recognize any good within the church to being able to say, okay, maybe I don't believe it, but I can recognize the good and I can recognize the good that's in it. And so because of that, I didn't want to damage my relationships with my close friends who I'd grown up with for so long, who believed, and my family members. And so even though I thought they were misguided and they didn't know the truth, I kind of kept it to myself. I would share it with the people who I was griping with about the church or who felt the same as me. And I shared it with some with my cousin who was active and who knew fully my experiences, and we would have conversations, but he still loved me and I still loved him, and we were able to get along fine. And we actually were living together during part of this time. And but most people close to me didn't know at this time. And for me, going to Seattle was a way to, in some ways, escape that and be able to find new friends and people who I could relate with more. And truly, I thought that I would find a better way of life out there, and one that brought me more happiness.
Is there anything you think that anyone could have done at this point before you went to Seattle? So, let's say your parents figure out, or maybe you tell them, I don't believe the church is true, I don't believe in God. Is there anything anyone could have done?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I've thought about that a lot. Honestly, I don't know that answer because I'm a very stubborn person. My wife would be the first to tell you that. And
so this is something that maybe you kind of had to let play out.
Yeah. Honestly, that might have been the scenario. It's possible that at some point down this path, if someone would have known and if someone would have interjected, or if I would have been, and frankly, I had friends and family members reach out to me during this time who would probe a little bit. I think they sensed, they knew, and they've told me in hindsight, they could see me going down this path slowly, although they didn't know the full extent, right? Because
did anyone ever say, hey, you're reading your scriptures, you're saying your prayers, you're going to church, and were they seeing red flags and identifying them and pointing them out to you?
Yeah, I think there were people who did that, but I would either lie, to be completely honest. I would say, oh yeah, things are great, I'm doing awesome, I'm doing fine. Or they would say, my mom, and it was small stuff. You know how moms are. I would post a picture, I'd say something on Facebook, and she would make a comment privately to me about, hey, do you think you should say that? Or do you think you should be doing this? Just small stuff. And I was stubborn. I always just deflected it. I always pushed it aside. And so I had a friend my cousin, who was maybe the only family member I had who knew completely what was going on. We had a mutual friend who also knew. And they were having a conversation, and this other friend told him, because he was worried about me, and they said to him, Rich is going to have to go through this and figure it out in order to come back and gain his testimony. Like, this is a process he needs to go through. And so I think my stubbornness just had to play out.
So, what advice would you have for friends or family members, for a mother who's worried and she sees this kind of thing starting to happen? What would you tell them?
they don't have a child that's as stubborn as me. That's more.
Yeah, everybody's different. So
right?
I mean, it's kind of hard to say this is this is the answer.
Yeah, I would say. I mean, the first thing is just love. Like you continue to love and support, which my family did, and so because of that, there were no bridges burned. Right? There's no one that's shunning me. There's no one that's like criticizing me or making me feel uncomfortable. And so love and support and saying, I think to say, hey, I see that you're doing these things. Is there any way that I can help? Maybe just reaching out and showing that support and then playing it from there, right? If that person's willing to accept support, then obviously you would go down that path.
Would you have been offended if somebody said, hey, I noticed you haven't been coming to church. I noticed you're not participating in this way or that way. Is there anything going on? Is there anything I can do to help? How would you have reacted to that?
I think I would have taken it okay. I think that I would have sidestepped it. I'm pretty good at
dodging.
Dodging.
Deflecting.
Dodging. Yeah. And a great example of that is I spent 6 years at BYU getting my degrees, 7 actually, 7 without getting married. And the pressure, to find someone and settle down. And I was very good at dodging that. And
so 7, you had a master's degree. Is
right,
that right?
Right. And so I was very good at dodging. But no, I don't think that I would have been offended at all. And I think that oftentimes members of the church, myself included, we may feel prompted to reach out to someone like that, but we're afraid to offend, and so we don't, or we dismiss it because we think, they're probably fine, and I think that it goes with that saying, if people don't care what you have to say until they know how much you care, right? And if people know that you care, and if people know that you love them, and if that foundation is there, that they're not going to be offended if you are reaching out with sincere concern. And so I think that's a good piece of advice for family members. If you feel like someone is going down this path, that you can reach out. Although that's not to say that they won't be offended, because some people are regardless, and some people are going to throw up their walls and their barriers and whatever. But love as the foundation, I think, is key, which I think most people do. But then maybe following that instinct and reaching out. But then if that person reacts negatively, to not distance yourself, which I think members of the church do because they don't want to offend. And so they pull back, and naturally that person feels like sometimes, oh, well, they're distancing themselves from me, and it creates this gap, right? And so then there's this gap, and so I think that it happens without people realizing that it's going on, and not on purpose, but yeah.
All right. So you finally get this chance to get away from the Mormons.
Yeah.
Go to Seattle and live your life.
Yeah.
And explore new vistas. And so how does that go for you?
It went pretty well. I had a great job. I was working this job with great people, and I was actually there was one other member of the church. Well, I mean, there were a few. There was one specifically in the building that I was working in who was also a member of the church, who was a graduate of BYU, and he was married and active and great, and we had a good relationship, but he was unaware of what I was going through as well, because I wasn't telling him. And so besides him, there were no other members of the church with who I was working with, but great people. And I I started looking for girls to date outside of the LDS faith. Although I had a little bit of a hard time because, and this is a side note, but even though I decided the church wasn't true, I still was not a fan of alcohol and drinking, and so I didn't want to drink, and I didn't drink, and I've never drank I've never tasted alcohol to this day, but it wasn't for religious reasons at the time. It was just because I didn't like it, and for health reasons, etc. And so, but that's so much of the social culture outside of really anyone that doesn't drink. And so anyway, that was a barrier to finding girls, because you go to a bar or a club or wherever to meet a girl, and you can't, I mean, you can buy them a drink, but if you're not drinking, it's weird, it's awkward. Anyway, so there were still challenges finding girls to date outside of Mormonism, even though I didn't believe in Mormonism anymore. And so it went well. And
were there members of the church who were contacting you? Did the local bishop know that you were in the area?
Yeah. So let's see. I'm trying to think of how it happened. I think
were your records up there?
When I moved up there, I feel it's kind of shameful. I feel ashamed to even admit this, but I saw the church up there as a way to possibly still meet girls, and so I still went to.
What was your plan? Would you deconvert them? Was that the idea, or?
Yeah, so I was open to whatever, right? I was open to finding a girl outside of the Mormon faith and marrying her, or finding a girl within the faith who then identified with the same feelings I had, and then we could, and because she had the same background and culture as me, it would probably be easier.
Understand you better.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so was there any of that going on with you where you would try to deconvert people and say, hey, did you know about this? And,
I was, to some extent, but not really, because like I said, I went from being cynical and negative towards the church to recognizing and seeing the good within the church and the good people within the church. And so I felt almost a obligation to not project my ideas on girls who were younger than me, because I was dating girls that were younger than me. And I didn't want them to leave the church because of me. If they left the church on their own, on their own path, without me like putting it in their mind, I was fine and happy with that. But I didn't want to destroy the faith that they had, and so I was careful in the way that I approached that. I was slow to open up to girls, to LDS girls, and that was one of the reasons that I broke up with a lot of girls that I dated that were LDS, is we would get to a point where I would open up because there's no way I'm going to marry a girl and then tell her after the fact, I don't believe that this church is true. That would be horrible. And so we'd get to a point in our dating, maybe, a month along or something. And I would start to express my concerns or my beliefs. And they were always, they would always try to help me. They would always try to help me understand the truthfulness of the gospel and regain my testimony. But none of them, but again, I was way stubborn, and I thought I knew more than them. I had more experience than them, and I was older than them, and all of that. And so ultimately that led to the end of all of these relationships, because they obviously wanted to get married in the temple, which I understood and I respected, but I wasn't there. And so, but I wasn't actively going out trying to deconvert,
Were you involved in any kinds of online communities of, ex-Mormons, or, were you still involved with groups that were critical of the church and complaining and, cynical? Or did that kind of end once you left Utah?
I wasn't involved in any groups. I was still in communication with my friends who I talked to over the phone, who identified with me, and we would talk about it and have conversations about it. I'm thinking of specific people that are coming to mind, which I don't want to name, but I would say maybe I differ from some people who leave the church in that I never, except for the time when I was going through my cynical stage and I was very negative towards the church. I didn't identify with the people who could never see any good within the church and were only trying to bash the church, because that just wasn't truthful either. Yeah, maybe I didn't believe that the church was true, and maybe the doctrines weren't what I thought they were. And yes, there were mistakes that were made by leaders, but that doesn't mean that they don't ever do anything good, or that they're not good.
So you had this phase, I guess, you went through where you saw the church as a bad thing, but then you kind of came through that phase.
Yeah.
And so then you believe the church is not true, but not bad.
Yeah. I think, yeah. And what's fascinating is there's this kind of reverse discrimination outside of Utah, right? Where it doesn't happen universally, but there's a anti-Mormon bias that exists. I mean, it, as evidenced by the large percentage of people who said they would not vote for Mitt Romney because he's Mormon. Like that was a higher percentage than people who said they're not going to vote for Barack Obama because he's black. There's obviously a bias against Mormonism out there in the world. And so I experienced that. And there's this weirdness that people get because oftentimes they don't understand the church. And so they are very negative towards it. And so I saw that kind of for the first time in my life. I mean, I had lived outside of Utah on my mission and at other times, but as an adult living in a community outside of Utah and interacting with people, and again, not the majority, but there is a minority of people who have this bias against Mormonism and say things that are ridiculously unintelligent and untrue about Mormonism. And I found myself finding that to be just as disingenuous as I thought maybe the problems I thought were within the church. So I saw problems on both sides of the spectrum, and I found myself in the middle to some degree, kind of caught in the middle as a boy who's been raised in Mormonism, now doesn't believe that it's true, but trying to find someone who can accept me for my Mormonism without bashing the good within the church. And that was a hard niche to find. You know?
Yeah. And so I guess at this point, the reasons you believe the church aren't true don't have a lot to do with thinking the church is bad, but more have to do with things like translation of the Book of Mormon or polygamy or, some historical or doctrinal types of issues. Is that right?
Actually at this point, at some point, I don't remember exactly when it happened, I went from not believing in God to regaining my belief in God, but not understanding him and thinking, okay, I believe that God exists. I've felt things and had experiences in my life where I do feel like there is something bigger than us. There is a creator, a God, something like that, right? But I don't completely understand him. I don't understand my relationship with him necessarily. And I don't necessarily think that he has a church out there, or if he does, I don't know what it is.
Yeah.
And so I actually went to some other churches. I went to some non-denominational Christian churches because they have, the same values that I grew up with, but maybe not some of the same other doctrines at the Mormon church. And so I thought that might be a good fit for me. But I found that to not. That was an interesting experience. I went with another friend of mine who was LDS in the area, who incidentally was not going through the same crisis I was, and who didn't know. But we went to see if we could find girls, which would have been the perfect fit for me, right? A Christian background, who had the same kind of upbringing, but isn't Mormon, and so, and we got, we had a kind of a bad experience where we go to this meeting and we're talking to people after, and then we get like boxed into this corner and people start asking, well, where are you guys from? And, oh, well, we came from Utah. Oh, what are you doing here? And then eventually they go, oh, you're from Utah. Are you guys Mormon? Yeah, we grew up Mormon. And then they started to pile on, and not to say that everyone there was doing this or was like that at all, but at least these people who were approaching us, they were very antagonistic towards us because we came from the Mormon faith. And so it wasn't a positive experience for me. And so I was like, okay, I'm not going back there, right? And anyway, so I was searching for something out there that was a replacement for Mormonism, which I didn't believe to be true. But I now had a belief in God, and but wasn't exactly sure where it stood.
If you like this podcast, you can help promote it by rating it in iTunes and by writing a review. Post a link to it on your blog or Facebook page and tell your friends about us. Questions or comments about this episode can be sent to podcast@fairlds.org or join the conversation at FairMormon blog. Music for this episode was provided courtesy of Paul Cardall. The opinions expressed in this episode are not necessarily the views of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints or of FairMormon.